All right, so let's see. Let's create a new test. And let's see, let's create it maybe down here. I think there's a test. There we go. Java, and in here we'll create a new unit test. Where's unit tests here? There are no unit tests? Nope. Interface. So this is test user. And in here we'll declare this as a test. JUnit. Is it not? What doesn't it like? Test not applicable to type. No? Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's applied to the function. So let's declare a function. So in the test, what we're going to do is that we're going to try and retrieve all the users from the database, right? So one of the things we need to do is get a hold of the instance of the repository. There's a user repository that we just created. We're going to be using that. And how are we going to get a hold of this instance? Usually we would have to instantiate this repository, right? Perhaps using new, and then calling whatever functions that repository has. Right? But instead of doing that, we're going to be using a design pattern that has become very, very common in many frameworks called inversion of control. Right? We're going to be able to inject instances of this object, right? By asking the framework to create an instance for us and then bind it to this local variable. Right? In Java, the way to do this is to use the auto-wired annotation. Right? Auto-wired annotation says, hey server, when you boot up, right, pass me an instance of this class, instantiate it for me, okay, and then bind it to this variable. Okay. The other thing is that we're gonna create we're gonna use this. Oops. We're going to test find all users as follows. Right, we're going to say list. There we go. Oops. Lists. I want Java util. Okay. And what we're missing here, user, student, no, that's user. Right. So how do we use this? How do we use the repository? So the repository, here's the repository instance. If I say dot, you'll notice these are all the functions that are already implemented for us, right, that we don't have to implement from scratch. Right. It has a count. We can ask, how many are there? This would be like select star count, count star group. Right, would tell us how many there are. There's a delete, and you can pass an instance of an object. It will find the record that matches this instance in memory, and it will remove that record based on the instance that is in memory. Delete all will remove all the records. Or oops, it has a delete by ID. If you give me the primary key of the record, I will remove that one record. Right? There's a find all. That's the one we're going to be using. Find all is going to retrieve all the records. It's going to give it back to us as an iterator. Right? Notice that an iterator is a better option as opposed to having an array or list, because an iterator allows us to just go next, next, next. Right? There's no way that it's going to load thousands of records in memory. So internally, it has a specific implementation of an iterator, which allows it to load perhaps 10 records at a time. Right? Load them into memory and then give it to us one at a time. Yes? So an iterator allows us to do that. So find all allows us to do that. So we're going to use find all. So find all returns as an iterator. You can cast it to anything you want. If you cast it into a list, you're forcing it to instantiate all the instances, right, and bringing them into memory, right? Unwind the iteration, right? Instantiate all the instances so that you can iterate for it here in the for loop. Right? So I'm casting it here to a list of users, where users is the instance that we created earlier, right? It's our Pojo, right? With the ID, with the username, for password, first name, last name, and we're just going to iterate it and retrieve the first name, right? So let's try that. Let's try this. So let's if we do Maven clean install again, it'll recompile, and by default it should run that test. Did it run the test? Oops. Null pointer, test user, build failure, blah, 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 test find null pointer where? 16. Oh, looks like the user repository is not loading here. Why are you not loading? I'm sorry? New here? No, AutoWire should have done that. Not quite sure why it didn't. Yeah, no, this will not work. User repository. Yeah, no, it's an interface anyway. Why are you not loading? Maybe it needs to be a test. Let's see. Test component now. Am I missing something? AutoWire should have worked. I'm sorry? No, it can't be out here. Test user. Let's see, can I run this? Just run the test? Same thing, right? Yeah, I got a null point exception. All right, I'm going to do it a different way. Let me remove that for a second. Let's see. Let me create my controller here. We'll say user controller. And in this controller, we're going to try and do the same thing here. We're going to say REST controller, and we're going to do an auto-wired of the user repository, and we're going to do a public list of users, and we want to be able to find all these users. So find all users, and we're going to return what the repository.findAll returns. And we need to cast it since I'm expecting a list of users. So list of users. There we go. And the other thing might be that we're going to map it to a get mapping so I can hit it from my browser. And this will be mapped to API users. Let's try that. Let's see if this blows up. The beauty of live coding. Okay, so that looks promising. Let's start the server. Jar with a target, and this is CS5200 jar. So that's that boots up, and meanwhile, we can try and hit the server with that data, with that request. Let's see. It would be local 8080, and I said API users, right? Users, let's see. Okay, it's better. It didn't blow up. It gave me an empty array. Oh, I know why. It probably blew away my table. Yes? It probably would just, what? Right, and when I did a Maven clean install, it probably blew away my table and recreated it, and now I don't have any records in there. So let's see if that's true. If I go there and do a query, indeed, I don't have any records. So let's reinsert them. Let's reinsert. Okay, they're there now. If we do a query again, we do have data. All right, so we're in business. All right, so this retrieved the data from the repository. The repository used this find all to retrieve this as an iterator, right? And we cast it to list, which then converted into JSON. How it gets converted into JSON, that's a completely different issue. Let's not get into that just yet. But just to point out here is that notice that the naming, look at the naming mapping here, is that we're back into the naming convention of the Java naming convention, right? Where we have camel case, where we have the capitalized each letter of each word. The data types are right, where the ID is an integer indeed, and everything else are strings. And we return an array, right, that represents these 3 records that we currently have, right? So yeah, so find all allows us to do that. Everybody good? All right, excellent. So now let's explore other things that JPA will allow us to do from their basic API.